I think it's very much understood that African American culture is extremely detrimental to us as a collective. And this toxic culture only adds to the disadvantages that we face in the world today. But the interesting part of this is that, man, I have searched high and low trying to figure out why this is. And with every investigative effort I take, and the conclusions that I come up with just seem way too simple for how serious this issue really is. Even though I have racked my brain and siphoned through all of the conversations and debates that I've had over the years surrounding this issue, I'm still trying to understand, how did we get to this point? And for my own sanity, I normally just chalk it up to Black people as a whole just make horrendous decisions, or we just have a poisonous culture. But I strongly believe that these answers are just very, very simplified, and that there must be a larger problem that's just not visible to the naked eye. For example, Black communities don't have a stranglehold on economic power. On average, we don't have a comfortable amount of wealth in our communities, but somehow we can find the dollars to spend on the most inconsequential stuff, like expensive cars with wheels that cost upwards of $5,000, $15,000, and you don't even own a piece of property. Dior bags, Louis Vuitton. I've been all across Europe in multiple occasions, and I can't remember any European wearing Louis Vuitton. It's only Black people, I swear, that I see putting emphasis on needing to possess this material stuff. Gold teeth with diamond bracelets and watches. They call it drip now. I call it stupid now. Look at the crime stats in our communities. Look at the out of wedlock birth rates in our communities. We fight and delete each other in alarming numbers. Look at the health conditions and the lack of knowledge as it relates to that. Look at our incarceration and drug use proportions against the national average. This stuff is astounding. Our damaged interpersonal relationships and the young Black youth in these communities by way of gangs and the violence that comes with that. Look at our sexual relationships between men and women. It almost appears like we don't like each other, and more so that we really hate each other. There's simply no respect for one another on both sides. The list is endless. And ladies and gentlemen, it is all bad. Like I said earlier, I've analyzed these topics and subjects over the years in detail, and I mean ad nauseum. But it's very difficult for me to get a solid understanding of where this all stems from. But I have this hypothesis, and it's going to include some science and a story about a man named Mr. Epps. Don't forget about Mr. Epps, because he's going to come back around on this video so that you'll have a clear picture of exactly who he was and how what he did may be the answer to the cause of why you see the Black community in such dysfunction. The science part of this is very interesting, and that's what I'm going to start with. So there's this field of science called epigenetics, and there's another field of science that is called intergenerational and transgenerational trauma. And since I'm not an expert, and I do not profess to be one, during my research, I came across many professionals who are well studied in this field who can better explain to you exactly what these scientific terms mean and how they may affect individuals. The first video, first off, before I play these videos, if you can all do me one favor, I need your help in this, is please like this video, subscribe to the channel, so that as I release new content, you'll be notified when those videos drop. So the first video is going to be on this scientific study called epigenetics. It's a small snippet, but I think it will open your eyes to think about the long-lasting effects centered around, this idea. And then the second video is going to be on inter and transgenerational trauma. Based on what I gather, inter and trans, they sort of work interchangeable, just depending on the conversation, but it's almost like they're one and the same. But take a listen to this.
Their susceptibility to disease. Even social experiences can cause epigenetic changes. In one famous experiment, when mother rats weren't attentive enough to their pups, genes in the babies that help them manage stress were methylated and turned off. And it might not stop with that generation. Most epigenetic marks are erased when egg and sperm cells are formed. But now, researchers think that some of those imprints survive, passing those epigenetic traits on to the next generation. Your mother's or your father's experiences as a child or choices as adults could actually shape your own epigenome. But even though epigenetic changes are sticky, they're not necessarily permanent. A balanced lifestyle that includes a healthy diet, exercise, and avoiding exposure to contaminants may, in the long run, create a healthy epigenome. It's an exciting time to be studying this. Scientists are just beginning to understand how epigenetics could explain mechanisms of human development and aging, as well as the origins of cancer, heart disease, mental illness, addiction, and many other conditions.
I find that very interesting. The study of epigenetics, how it can basically alter the DNA, or how it could suppress the transmission of information that comes from it's confusing to me. All in all, they understand that this is a long-term effect on people. And for inter and transgenerational trauma, during my research, I came across a definition. And it's basically saying that it's generally subconscious transmission of traumatic experiences to subsequent generations and to society. This is heavy information. So, I said that I built this channel for a couple different reasons. One was to highlight the crazy, the madness, the dysfunction that's taken place in our society. And the second reason, equally as important as the first, was that it was going to be therapeutic for me, because these are a lot of topics that I've been wanting to talk about. But the way the world is situated today, it's kind of hard to have these conversations with people without someone getting triggered or you finding yourself alienated and canceled. Now, I'm not saying that this is the holy grail for the reasons that people and the Black community are in such dire straits. I am simply looking at this as just another option that could potentially add and support an alternative perspective of looking at this situation. I don't know about you, but I think this science of epigenetics is pretty interesting. But if that doesn't pique your interest, and I don't see how it couldn't, take a look at the other two terms that I mentioned, intergenerational and transgenerational trauma. Now, I gave you the definition of these terms and how they sort of interchange with each other earlier, but I'm going to play this video for you where there is a certified professional, I believe she's a psychologist. She provides some examples and insight to how this may affect one's life long term and then be transmitted to future generations along the way. So take a listen to this.
Okay.
Trauma expert Simone Jacobs says everything was and is far from okay in the aftermath of slavery.
Slavery was a systematic process of abuse that went on for hundreds of years. We have to understand that in order to keep a group of people subjugated, you have to destroy family connections. You have to destroy attachments. And so what slavery did, how you kept 30 people who were working in your fields from attacking the 10 people up in the big house, was that you made sure that they were constantly living in fear. I think the statistics are like 1 in 3 marriages were broken up, 1 in 5 children were taken away from their parents, but that's just the statistics. We know that it was much worse than that. And we also know that you only have to do that to one family for it to have a devastating effect on everybody else.
Jacob says that by disrupting attachments among family members, enslavers cause deep destabilization that can continue for generations. After slavery, promises of government support were short-lived or unfulfilled. Despite that, Black people built thriving communities through their own resilience, intelligence, and ingenuity. Often, as in the case of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, racism stepped forward to violently interrupt Black progress, creating more trauma.
Money exchanged hands 12 times before it left the community. But then you get the act of destruction of that community, and that's going to have ripple effects, right? Obviously on the people directly involved in that destruction, but it's going to affect other people in other places so they no longer feel secure too. So those are the ways in which breaking up a person's sense of security can have long-term effects.
Long-term effects that stretch into the present. Carrie Mosley Hobbs, with her family's More Than a Fraction Foundation, is exploring the impact of their family's enslavement at Smithfield Plantation in Blacksburg.
It's hard to talk about the enslaved communities because there's not any documentation. And so we realize as a family that we are the documentation.
Now, those are just a couple examples of, although they didn't say the terms inter and transgenerational trauma, but they did outline some examples of how this can affect one's life. But I got one more professional that I want you to listen to, and she's highly respected. She is known for coining the term post-traumatic slave syndrome, where she basically talks about a lot of the characteristics you see in Black people and within their communities stems from the horrific experiences that their ancestors had in past generations, but you see it manifest itself in the folks today. So just listen to what she has to say about, all of the trauma that this group of people were forced to go through, and how there wasn't a single time in history where they received some professional intervention to help them walk through a lot of these psychological, emotional complications that they're living with. Her name is Dr. Joy DeGruy. I never know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's either DeGruy or DeGruy. Last name is spelled Degruy. She's a highly respected scholar. She is a lecturer, author. She's been all over the world having this conversation and educating people on this topic of post-traumatic slave syndrome. To be honest with you, I love how she presents her message. I love the way she delivers her lectures. She doesn't care. She's going to tell you what it is. She has the attitude as if she's heard it all. She's over the bullshit, and either you're going to accept it or you're not. But she's not going to tiptoe around your uncomfortness. So I like that about her. Tell me what you guys think.
PTSD is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder, because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. All of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were African-American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death, that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, we know finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being Black? How does factoring in being Black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it. because you see it's habitual. You're socialized. It becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information, they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a clinical setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice and safety and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppress you and to continue to injure you. Both those things have to be dealt with. And they cannot singularly by themselves affect a change. They have to be done collectively. But when we start talking about chattel slavery, we're not talking about one trauma. We're not talking about a specific event. We're talking about generations of trauma with no intervention. Based on what I know about sugar plantations, tobacco, and the Caribbean, what I know about American chattel slavery and the plantations there, does anyone right now ever recall mental health assistance to slaves? Anybody remember sending in the therapist after I sold off your son, daughter, raped folks? At any point? Never. Second question. After slavery was officially over, now you're free. Anybody remember any therapy then? We know it's been rough, it's been deep for you, it's been difficult. We're going to do a little group therapy. Anybody remember that? That would be no. Number 3, after slavery officially ended, both in the States, in the Caribbean, the British ended, do you remember whether or not trauma continued? Did the trauma continue for people of African descent? I need to know. Okay, so now let's do the math. Hundreds of years of trauma, no treatment. Freed, more trauma, no treatment. What do you do the math? Do you think there may be residual impacts of that trauma? Of course there is. It didn't end, friends, and it hasn't ended yet.
Let me know what you think about that down in the comments section. I mean, this has been a history that has been suffered upon a people for more than a few hundred years. So when I'm searching my brain and racking my mind, trying to find the reasons why our people or our community is in so much dysfunction, this kind of is a little therapeutic for me because it opens up my eyes a little more to what the possibilities may be that can explain the current situation. So what do you guys think? Do you think that a history that has been suffered upon a people for so long that the lineage of that group that we see walking around the streets today is possibly still affected by the trauma that their ancestors received? Now, Mr. Epps, I told you I was going to tell you a story about this individual. He's not very unique in history. I just think that it would resonate with you because he was the individual in the movie called 12 Years a Slave. I don't know if anybody's had an opportunity to see that, but unbelievable movie. It's kind of gruesome, but his real name is Michael Fassbender. He's a great actor. He is the farmer or the slaver that has a relationship with Patsy. And her real name is Lupita Nyong'o. She's an African actress, very beautiful. She's played in many movies. But there's also another important figure in the movie. Actually, the movie is centered around him. He's the actor known as Chiwetel Ejiofor, plays in really, really good movies. But in this movie, 12 Years a Slave, his name is Solomon Northup. And he gets captured. He was a free black person. Then he gets captured, sold into slavery for 12 years. And he has an interesting relationship with Mr. Epps as well. If you haven't seen it, you gotta watch it. If you have seen it, you know what I'm talking about. If you remember, the relationship between Mr. Epps and Patsy was one of assault, sexual assault. This was not a unique experience for a lot of captive slaves. Just think of Thomas Jefferson and his slave, Sally Hemings, who he had a whole entire family by. So while Mr. Epps was assaulting Patsy in the most violent way, she lived under an enormous amount of fear, just terrified to have to get up every day and deal with this individual. Now, Solomon Northrop, or Chiwetel Ejiofor, also worked for Mr. Epps. And if you remember the incident where they had tried to hang Solomon because he made an attempt to protect Patsy from Mr. Epps on one occasion. And they hung him from this tree for, I want to say it was just over 24 hours or just under 24 hours. And they hung him just enough that his tiptoes can touch the ground. So he used his toes as leverage so that the force of the rope around his neck didn't completely suffocate him or kill him. And he was standing on his tippy toes for more than 24 hours just to save his own life. But the overarching point that I'm trying to make is that Solomon and Patsy, although they were fictional characters in this movie, they weren't unique because this was very common throughout the history of this country and even abroad, where African peoples were subject to this type of treatment from European slavers. But what I'm trying to say is that when you're thinking about epigenetics and you're thinking about intergenerational and transgenerational trauma, think about Patsy and Solomon being someone's great, great, great grandmother and grandfather, and they're walking around today. Think about the traumas that those two had to deal with, and think about how Dr. Joy DeGruy explained the effects of that. So when I'm questioning what in the hell is happening in the Black community, I reflect on this type of stuff. I listen to what the professionals have to say about what may be going on, because clearly there's a download malfunction.
System malfunction.